The moment my father grabbed my arm at the New Year's party, the room went quiet in a way I had never heard before. Not awkward quiet, not polite quiet. The kind of silence that sucks the air out of your chest and makes you realize something has gone terribly wrong. His fingers dug into my skin hard enough that I knew I'd have marks in the morning, and he leaned in close, his voice low and furious. "You will do as I say." Around us, 20 relatives and family friends froze with their champagne glasses halfway to their lips. No one stepped in. No one spoke. And that was when a calm voice came from the kitchen doorway, steady and unmistakably out of place. "If I were you, Michael, I wouldn't do that. If you're wondering how a New Year's celebration turned into a public showdown over a $3.5 million home, you're not alone. My name is Claire Whitman. I was 31 years old at the time, and my family had no idea who I really was, or how far they were about to push me. If stories about family betrayal, inheritance, and the moment someone finally says no resonate with you, you might want to stay with me. And if you've lived through something similar, you're not as alone as you think. The party was supposed to be a fresh start. That's what my mother had said when she mailed the invitation printed on thick cream paper with gold lettering that felt more like a corporate gala than a family gathering. New Year's Eve at my parents' house had always been loud, crowded, and chaotic, but never formal. This time there was a valet out front, a caterer in the kitchen, even a string quartet tucked awkwardly into the corner of the living room as if tradition itself had been hired for the evening. I arrived early because I didn't want to give anyone ammunition. The house was already buzzing. My aunts clustered near the bar, my uncles talking business near the fireplace. My brother Ethan stood beside my father laughing too loudly, his hand resting possessively on the back of a chair like he already owned the place. When he saw me, his smile tightened. Not warm, calculated. "Claire," my mother said, air-kissing my cheek. "You made it." I noticed she didn't ask how I was. I found a spot near the edge of the room and tried to disappear. That had been my strategy my whole life. Be pleasant. Be quiet. Don't challenge the version of me they'd already decided on. The daughter who did fine but nothing special. The sister who should be grateful her brother would someday take over the family legacy. What they didn't know was that my grandfather Samuel Whitman had changed everything before he passed. They didn't know he'd left me his coastal home, the one overlooking the water, the one my father always referred to as the real inheritance. $3.5 million worth of stone glass and memories. They knew about the will, of course, but they truly believed, that I would never dare keep it. Midway through the night, my father tapped his glass and the music stopped. He smiled the way he did when he was about to make an announcement that wasn't really optional. He talked about family, about tradition, about honoring the past and protecting the future. Every word felt rehearsed heavy with meaning I didn't like. Then he gestured to my brother. Ethan cleared his throat and launched into a speech about responsibility, about being the eldest son, about how some things like legacy homes should stay in the male line. Heads nodded. Someone murmured agreement. My mother dabbed her eyes like this was all very emotional. That's when my father turned to me and placed a folder on the table beside us. "It's just paperwork, Claire," he said smoothly. "A formality. You sign and we can all move forward." I opened the folder and felt my stomach drop. A transfer agreement. My signature line waiting at the bottom like a trap. I looked up at him and said the word I had never been allowed to say. No. At first he laughed like I'd told a joke. Then the room shifted. Conversations stopped. Faces turned. My brother's jaw clenched. My mother whispered my name like a warning. "Don't make this difficult," my father said. "Everyone here understands what's right." I repeated myself. No. That was when his hand closed around my arm. Standing there with his grip tightening and all those familiar faces, watching something inside me finally snapped. Not in a loud, dramatic way. In a quiet, irreversible one. I realized that this wasn't about the house. It never had been. It was about obedience. About proving that no matter what my grandfather had decided, no matter what I had built for myself, they could still make me fall back in line. And then that voice came from the kitchen doorway, cutting through the tension like a blade. "If I were you, Michael, I wouldn't do that." My father turned his face draining of color, and in that moment I knew this story was about to change. 4 weeks earlier at Thanksgiving, no one grabbed my arm. No voices were raised. No documents appeared. But that was the night I understood exactly where I stood in my family long before the New Year's party ever happened. I arrived late, which didn't help. 20 minutes, maybe a little more, because I'd been stuck on a call that refused to end. I texted my mother twice from the car, explaining, apologizing, promising I was almost there. When I walked through the front door, the smell of roasted turkey hit me first, warm and familiar, followed by the sound of laughter already in progress. My mother glanced up from the dining table and sighed. "Claire, you're always late," she said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "Can't you plan better just once?" I opened my mouth to explain. I'd been dealing with an urgent issue for a client, something that couldn't wait until Monday. Something important. But before I could say a word, my brother's voice cut in from the other side of the room. "Still playing catch-up with work," Ethan said with a grin. "Must be exhausting doing all that busy stuff without actually getting anywhere." A few people chuckled. Not loudly, just enough to let me know the joke landed. I smiled because that's what I'd learned to do. Smile, shrug, move on. I took the empty seat at the far end of the table away from my father, who sat at the head like he always did. He didn't look at me. He was too busy asking Ethan about a development project I'd already heard about 3 times through secondhand stories. "Closed last week," Ethan said, leaning back comfortably. "Big one. Everyone's pretty impressed." My father beamed. "That's my son," he said, pride clear in his voice. "Always moving forward." I pushed food around my plate and listened. No one asked what I'd been doing. No one asked why I was late. When I spoke, conversations flowed right over my words like I hadn't said anything at all. That night, sitting there between relatives who barely noticed me, something shifted. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. I realized that no matter what I achieved, no matter how hard I worked, I would always be an afterthought at that table. The truth was, my life outside that house didn't look anything like the version they'd settled on. During the week, I lived 3 hours away in a city they liked to complain about, but rarely visited. I had a job that demanded long hours and sharper thinking than they gave me credit for. I paid my own bills. I made my own decisions. I'd built something solid, something real, even if they refused to see it. There was only one person in my family who ever had. My grandfather Samuel Whitman had never treated me like background noise. When I visited him, he listened. Not the polite, distracted listening adults sometimes do with younger relatives, but real attention. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered details. When he laughed, it wasn't indulgent. It was genuine. After Thanksgiving dinner, while everyone else lingered over pie and loud conversation, I slipped outside onto the back porch to breathe. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting my lungs. A few minutes later, Grandpa joined me, wrapping his coat tighter around himself. "You doing okay?" he asked. I nodded automatically. Then I shook my head. "I don't know," I said. "I feel like I'm invisible in there." He studied me for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "You're not invisible," he said. "They just aren't looking." That was how he always spoke. Quiet. Direct. No unnecessary comfort, no excuses made on anyone's behalf. We talked for a while about nothing important, the weather, a book he was reading, a memory from when I was a kid that made me laugh despite myself. When I went back inside, the sting of the evening felt dulled, but not gone. In the weeks that followed, things escalated in subtle ways. My mother started calling more often, her tone unusually careful. She asked how work was going, then gently steered the conversation toward family matters. My father didn't call at all. When he did speak to me, it was through her, like I was a problem best handled indirectly. Ethan texted me jokes about the house, about how funny it was that Grandpa had named me in the will, about how obviously temporary the situation was. You know Dad's not going to let this stand one message read. Might as well make it easy on everyone. I didn't respond. I visited Grandpa every weekend after that. His health had been declining for months, but his mind was as sharp as ever. We sat in his living room, the windows looking out over the water, the same view he'd loved for decades. He talked about his life, about mistakes he'd made, about things he wished he'd done differently. One afternoon, out of nowhere, he asked me, if you didn't have to ask permission, what would you choose? I laughed nervously. Permission from who? Anyone, he said. Family. Expectations. Fear. I thought about it. Really thought. The answer surprised me. Peace, I said finally. I'd choose peace. He nodded as if I'd confirmed something he already knew. A week later, my mother called and asked if I'd be home for New Year's Eve. Her voice was bright, almost forced. We're doing something special this year, she said. Everyone will be there. I hesitated. What kind of special? Oh, you'll see, she replied. It's time we all moved forward. After we hung up, I sat on my couch staring at my phone. The words echoed in my head. Move forward. Together. Family. By then I understood what they meant. They weren't inviting me to celebrate. They were inviting me to comply. And despite everything in me that wanted to stay away, I knew I was going to go. Not because I believed it would end well, but because I needed to see it through. I needed to stop running from the moment they'd been building toward my entire life. I just didn't yet know how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. The week after Thanksgiving, I went back to my apartment and tried to return to my normal life, but something had shifted. The comments at the table, the jokes, the careful phone calls from my mother, they stayed with me in a way they never had before. For the first time, I stopped telling myself it didn't matter. On Monday morning, I walked into my office like I always did, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, already mentally organizing my day. The building was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that comes before everyone arrives and the real work begins. I liked it that way. It reminded me that my life didn't revolve around family dinners or expectations I never agreed to. By noon, I was deep into meetings, deadlines, numbers, decisions that actually carried weight. People listened when I spoke. They asked my opinion and waited for the answer. No one laughed at my work or called it busy stuff. No one questioned whether what I did mattered. That contrast used to comfort me. That week it made everything sharper. On Tuesday, my colleague and closest friend Hannah noticed something was off. We were grabbing lunch downstairs when she asked casually at first, "You okay? You've been quieter than usual." I hesitated. I wasn't used to talking about my family at work. It felt like mixing two worlds that were better kept separate. But the words came out anyway. "They want me to give something up," I said. "Something my grandfather left me." She looked at me carefully. "Do you want to?" "No," I said without hesitation. The certainty surprised me. "Then why is this even a conversation?" she asked. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because it's my family." She shook her head slowly. "Claire family doesn't get to take things from you just because they feel entitled." That was the first time someone had said it that plainly. No qualifiers, no guilt layered into the truth. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. Another joke, another reminder that he and my father were assuming an outcome I had never agreed to. "You coming around yet?" he wrote. "Dad says we'll talk it through at New Year's." I stared at the screen, then locked my phone without replying. I drove to see Grandpa that weekend, the familiar route calming me as it always did. His house sat quiet against the gray winter sky, the ocean restless beyond the windows. He was sitting in his chair when I arrived, a blanket over his legs, a book resting unopened on the armrest. "You look tired," he said as soon as he saw me. I smiled weakly. "I am." We talked for a while about ordinary things, but eventually the silence stretched, and I found myself telling him more than I'd planned. About Thanksgiving, about the calls, about New Year's. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "They're counting on you folding," he said. "You know that, don't you?" "Yes," I admitted. "They always have." "And are you going to?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, I can't." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Good." I looked at him, then really looked, and wondered how much he already knew, how much he had seen coming long before I did. On the drive home, I thought about the house, the one everyone suddenly cared so deeply about. It wasn't just a property. It was proof. Proof that my grandfather had trusted me. Proof that he'd seen something in me my parents never had. The following days felt like a slow tightening of a vice. My mother called twice more each time, careful, almost rehearsed. She talked about family unity, about how hard things had been on my father since Grandpa passed, about how Ethan was under so much pressure. "What about me?" I asked once quietly. There was a pause on the line. "This isn't about you," she said, and I felt something in me go cold. That night I sat alone on my couch, the city humming faintly through the windows, and made a decision. I wasn't going to explain myself anymore. I wasn't going to argue my worth or justify my grandfather's choices. If they wanted a confrontation, they were going to get one, just not on their terms. 2 days before New Year's, the invitation arrived, even though my mother had already mentioned it. Thick paper, formal language, a guest list that read more like a networking event than a family celebration. Black tie encouraged. I laughed out loud when I read that line, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed everything I'd been trying not to see. This wasn't a party. It was a stage. That evening, Hannah came over with takeout and wine. I showed her the invitation. "They're setting you up," she said immediately. "I know," I replied, "so don't go." I shook my head. "If I don't, they'll tell everyone I refused, that I was being dramatic, difficult, ungrateful. And if you do go," I thought about that. About the folder my father would eventually slide across the table. About the eyes watching me, waiting for me to comply. "Then I get to say no to their faces," I said. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Promise me something." "What?" "That you won't sign anything. No matter what." "I won't," I said. And this time, I believed it. The night before New Year's, I barely slept. I kept replaying conversations that hadn't happened yet, imagining different outcomes. But beneath the anxiety, there was something else. A steadiness I'd never felt before. A sense that whatever happened, I wasn't going to lose myself trying to keep the peace. I didn't know about the lawyer yet. I didn't know about the documents or the voice that would cut through the room at exactly the right moment. All I knew was that I was done pretending this was a misunderstanding. They wanted obedience. I was finally ready to refuse. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I finally picked it up again. Thick paper. Heavy weight. The kind of thing meant to feel important in your hands. I turned it over slowly, as if it might say something different the second time I looked at it. New Year's Eve. Formal attire. Family and friends. There was nothing openly threatening about it. That was the problem. Every word was polite. Careful. Too careful. It read like a statement, not an invitation, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been written with an audience in mind. I thought back to every holiday we'd ever had. Pajamas, loud music, someone always burning something in the kitchen. This wasn't that. This was curated. Designed. When I called my mother to ask who was coming, her answer confirmed what my gut already knew. "Oh, just everyone," she said lightly. Your aunts and uncles, of course. A few friends from your father's circle. Some people from the club. It'll be nice to start the year surrounded by community. Community. The word landed wrong. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my couch and stared at the wall, replaying the conversation. She hadn't mentioned my cousin's kids, or old neighbors, or anyone who actually knew me. Just people whose opinions mattered to my father. People who validated him. That was when it clicked. This wasn't about celebration. It was about witnesses. The next day at work, I mentioned the party to Hannah in passing. I tried to sound casual, like it was just another family obligation. She didn't buy it for a second. "That's not a party," she said, frowning. "That's a pressure cooker." I laughed softly. "You think I'm overreacting?" "No," she said. "I think you're underreacting. Why invite that many people if it's just about family?" I didn't answer because we both knew why. Public pressure works differently. It turns refusal into embarrassment, silence into compliance. It makes saying no feel rude, selfish, disruptive. My father had always understood that. He knew how to use a room. What unsettled me most was his sudden silence. After weeks of indirect messages and carefully worded pressure through my mother and my brother, he had gone quiet. No calls, no texts, not even a clipped message reminding me to be on time. At first, I told myself it was relief, that maybe he'd backed off. But I'd grown up with him. I knew better. When my father went quiet, it meant he was waiting, conserving authority, saving his voice for when it would matter most. 2 days before the party, Ethan sent a short message. "Big night coming up. Let's all keep things respectful." Respectful. The word made my jaw tighten. In our family, respect had always meant obedience, falling in line, not making scenes. That night, I stood in front of my closet longer than I should have, staring at clothes that suddenly felt symbolic. Anything too bold would be called attention-seeking. Anything too plain would be taken as weakness. I realized how ridiculous that was, how deeply the conditioning ran. I chose something simple, neutral, comfortable, not armor. Not a statement. Just me. The morning of New Year's Eve, I woke up with a knot in my stomach but a strange clarity in my chest. I went for a walk, letting the cold air ground me. I thought about Grandpa, about the way he'd asked questions without expecting the answer he wanted, about the trust he'd shown me when no one else had. By the time I got back home, my decision was solid. I was going. Not because I wanted to, not because I thought it would end well, but because if I didn't show up, the story would be written without me. They would say I was dramatic, uncooperative, that I'd refuse to come because I couldn't face reason. If I went, at least the truth would be mine to tell, even if no one wanted to hear it. A few hours before I left, my mother called again. "Just so you know," she said, her voice strained with forced brightness, "your father really wants tonight to be peaceful." "I want that too," I said. "Then please," she added quickly, "don't make this harder than it needs to be." There it was, the warning dressed as a request. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even afraid, not exactly. I was sad. Sad that peace in my family had always depended on my silence. As I got ready to leave, my phone buzzed with a final message. Not from my father. Not from my mother. From a family friend I barely knew. "Looking forward to seeing you tonight. Your father says it's an important evening." I stared at the screen, my heart thudding slowly. Important. Not joyful. Not fun. Important. That was the confirmation I needed. When I finally stepped out into the cold and headed for my car, I knew exactly what was waiting for me. A room full of eyes, a carefully framed narrative, a moment designed to corner me. They thought the party would trap me. What they didn't know was that I was walking in fully aware of the trap. The night before New Year's Eve, sleep refused to come. I lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the city outside my window. my mind circling the same place it always did when I felt cornered. Not my father's voice, not Ethan's smug certainty. My grandfather. Samuel Whitman had been the only person in my family who ever looked at me without trying to shape me into something else. When I was younger, I thought that was just affection. As I got older, I realized it was respect. I could picture him clearly sitting in his favorite chair by the window, the ocean stretching endlessly beyond the glass. He liked mornings best, liked watching the light change over the water. He said it reminded him that nothing stayed still forever, not even the things people swore were tradition. The first time I understood that he saw me differently was years ago when I was still trying to earn approval I would never get. I'd been rambling really about a choice I was struggling with. I expected advice, direction. Instead, he listened until I finished, then asked a single question. "What do you want, Claire?" No one had ever asked me that without immediately following it with conditions. I remember hesitating, unsure if there was a right answer. He waited. No impatience, no correction, just space. That was his gift. He made room. Over the years, I spent more time with him as the rest of the family slowly drifted away. They had lives, excuses, obligations. I had weekends, a car, and a grandfather who never pretended he didn't need company. We talked about everything except money. He never mentioned inheritance, never hinted at plans. When the subject of legacy came up, it was always in abstract terms: responsibility, care, the quiet work of showing up. People think legacy is about what you leave behind. He told me once, staring out at the water. It's really about who you trust to carry what matters. I didn't know then how carefully he was choosing his words. As his health declined, I came more often. Sometimes just for the afternoon, sometimes overnight when the weather was bad or he seemed especially tired. I cooked simple meals, sorted mail, sat with him when he didn't feel like talking. It never felt like sacrifice. It felt like being exactly where I was supposed to be. My father visited too occasionally, always brief, always busy. He stood in doorways instead of sitting down, checked his watch more than he looked at his own father's face. Ethan came even less usually around holidays, usually with an air of obligation. After one of those visits, Grandpa turned to me and said quietly, "People show you who they are when nothing is being asked of them." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. There were moments looking back that stand out now with new clarity. The afternoon he asked me to help him organize papers, insisting on doing it properly, not because he was confused, but because he liked things clear. The time he asked if I trusted lawyers, and when I answered honestly, he nodded like he'd expected it. Once as I was leaving, he squeezed my hand and said, "You have a spine. Don't let anyone convince you it's a flaw." At the time, I thought it was just encouragement. Now I knew it was preparation. In the present, sitting on my bed with the glow of the city flickering through the curtains, I realized something that steadied me. My grandfather hadn't made his decisions in a vacuum. He hadn't been impulsive or sentimental. He had watched. He had measured. He had anticipated exactly the kind of pressure I was about to face. That realization changed everything. The house wasn't a gift meant to flatter or provoke. It was a statement. A line drawn with intention. He hadn't given it to me because I was his granddaughter. He'd given it to me because I was the one who wouldn't misuse it, or surrender it. I thought about the way my father talked about tradition, how often he used it as a shield. Tradition had always served him. It had never served me. Grandpa knew that. He had lived long enough to see the difference between preserving values and preserving power. By the time dawn crept into the room, my anxiety had softened into something quieter and stronger. Resolve. When I finally slept, I dreamed of the house. Not as a prize, but as a place. The sound of the waves. The worn arm of the chair where Grandpa used to sit. The desk by the window where he'd kept his books and notes. It felt less like inheritance and more like trust. I woke up to a message from my mother sent early. "Big day," it read. Let's try to make this a fresh start." I didn't reply. As I got dressed later that evening, I moved slowly, deliberately. There was no rush, no frantic rehearsing of what I might say. I already knew what mattered. I wasn't going to convince them. I wasn't going to win them over. I was going to honor the one person who had never asked me to be smaller. Driving toward my parents' house, the sky already darkening, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Whatever happened tonight, it wouldn't erase what my grandfather had given me. Not the house, the certainty. He had seen the patterns long before I did. He had trusted me not because I was compliant, but because I was capable of standing alone. As I pulled into the long driveway, lights blazing inside silhouettes moving behind the windows, I took one last, steadying breath. They thought this was about control, but my grandfather had never raised me to hand my life over to anyone else. The house was already glowing when I arrived, every window lit like a display. A valet opened my door before I could reach for the handle, and the sound of music drifted out as I stepped onto the front walk. It wasn't loud. It was controlled, polished, the kind of atmosphere meant to impress, not celebrate. Inside the foyer buzzed with conversation. People I recognized only vaguely turned as I entered, their eyes flicking over me with quick assessments before sliding away. Champagne glasses clinked. Someone laughed a little too hard. The air smelled like expensive perfume and catered food. My mother appeared almost immediately, her smile fixed and brittle. "You're early," she said, like it mattered. "I didn't want to be late," I replied. She nodded, relief flashing across her face before she ushered me toward a cluster of relatives. Introductions followed. Names I'd heard my entire life, faces I rarely saw outside of events like this. Everyone was friendly, warm, too warm. Compliments floated my way, vague and impersonal. "You look well. New year, new beginnings." I felt like I was being wrapped in cotton. My father stood near the center of the room holding court. He looked comfortable, relaxed, exactly where he liked to be. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod. Not affection. A signal. Ethan hovered nearby, laughing with two of my father's friends. When he noticed me watching, he lifted his glass in a mock toast. His confidence hadn't wavered. Not yet. Dinner was served precisely on schedule. The long table gleamed under soft lighting, place cards neatly arranged. Mine sat near the far end, flanked by people who barely acknowledged me once they sat down. My father took the head of the table, my brother at his right hand. The arrangement wasn't accidental. Conversation flowed easily around me. Business deals, travel plans, mutual acquaintances. No one asked about my life. When someone finally did, Ethan answered for me. "She works a lot," he said lightly. "Always busy." I smiled thinly and said nothing. Halfway through the meal, my father stood and tapped his glass. The room quieted instantly. He smiled, that practiced expression he used when he wanted agreement without debate. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he began. "Family is everything. Tradition matters, especially as we move into a new year." Heads nodded. My mother dabbed at her eyes. "There's been a lot of change recently," he continued. "And sometimes change creates confusion. But it's our responsibility to make sure the things that matter stay where they belong." I felt the tension rise, slow and unmistakable. He gestured to Ethan, who stood smoothly, already prepared. "We've always believed that legacy comes with responsibility," my brother said. "And that responsibility has to be handled by the right person." He turned slightly, addressing the table. "Not me. This house, this family, everything we've built, it's not about favoritism. It's about continuity." My father reached down and picked up a slim folder from beside his chair. "This is just a formality," he said, holding it up. "Something to put an unfortunate misunderstanding to rest." He walked toward me and placed the folder on the table in front of my plate. "Sign it," he said quietly, "and we can all enjoy the rest of the evening." I opened the folder, even though I already knew what I would find. Legal language, Transfer of ownership. My name printed neatly at the bottom. I closed it and slid it back toward him. "No," I said. The word landed heavier than I expected. For a moment my father laughed. "Don't be dramatic," he said. "Everyone here understands." "I understand," I replied, "and I'm not signing." The room stilled. Someone cleared their throat. The music from the other room felt suddenly too loud. My father's smile faded. "Claire," he said, lowering his voice, "don't make this harder than it needs to be." I met his gaze. "It doesn't have to be hard. I've already said no." Ethan scoffed. "You can't be serious," he said. "Think about what you're doing. Think about the family." "I am," I said. "I'm thinking about what Grandpa wanted." That did it. My father's jaw tightened. "This isn't about what he wanted." He snapped. He was old. He didn't understand the consequences. I stood. He understood exactly what he was doing. My mother whispered my name, panic creeping into her voice. "Please," she said. "Not like this." My father stepped closer. "Sit down," he said. "I'm not signing anything I repeated." His hand closed around my arm. It happened so fast I barely registered it at first. The pressure, the heat, his fingers digging in with intent, not restraint. Pain flared sharp and immediate. "You will do as I say," he growled, leaning in close enough that I could smell the wine on his breath. I gasped. "Let go of me." Around us, chairs scraped softly as people shifted. No one moved closer. No one spoke. Ethan stared at the table. My mother covered her mouth, eyes wide, but she stayed seated. The silence was deafening. In that moment, something inside me broke free. Not fear, not hope, illusion. I saw him clearly, stripped of the authority I'd given him my entire life. This wasn't protection. It was control, and it would never be satisfied. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking, "you're hurting me." His grip tightened, and then a voice cut through the room, calm and steady, utterly unafraid. "If I were you, Michael, I wouldn't do that." Every head turned toward the kitchen doorway. My father froze, his hand still locked around my arm as the room held its breath. The room stayed frozen for a beat that felt far longer than it was. My father's hand was still clamped around my arm, his fingers rigid, his authority stalled mid-command. No one breathed, no one moved. All eyes shifted toward the kitchen doorway where the voice had come from. A man stepped forward into the light, unhurried, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need permission to speak. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a dark suit that looked almost severe against the festive decorations. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply stood there, taking in the scene with a calm that felt almost surgical. "If I were you, Michael," he said again evenly, "I'd let her go." My father's face flushed, then paled. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, trying to recover the room with volume alone. The man's gaze flicked briefly to my arm, still trapped in my father's grip, then back to his face. "That's not important yet," he said. "What is important is that you're currently laying hands on your adult daughter in front of witnesses." A murmur rippled through the room. Someone set their glass down too hard. My mother made a small sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "This is a private family matter," my father snapped. "It stopped being private when you turned it into a performance," the man replied. "And when you used force." My father looked around suddenly, aware of the eyes on him. The phones discreetly lowered, the people who mattered watching closely. Slowly, reluctantly, he released my arm. I stumbled back a step, my hand flying instinctively to the spot where his fingers had been. The pain pulsed hot beneath my skin. The man moved immediately, positioning himself between us without touching either of us, his presence a barrier as much as a statement. "Are you all right?" he asked me quietly. I nodded, though my heart was still hammering. "I will be." He inclined his head, then turned back to my father. Now he said we can talk. My father straightened, tugging at his jacket like he was resetting himself. You're overstepping, he said. You have no place in this. The man finally offered his name, his tone unchanged. My name is Daniel Roth, he said. I was Samuel Whitman's attorney. The effect was immediate. Faces shifted. Ethan's head snapped up. My mother's hand flew to her chest. I witnessed the execution of his will. Daniel continued, and I'm here because Samuel asked me to be. That's absurd, my father said, but the certainty in his voice had cracked. My father was confused near the end. Everyone knows that. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his briefcase and rested his hand on the leather, letting the gesture speak for itself. Samuel was of sound mind, he said, and he anticipated this exact scenario. The room leaned in attention, sharpening. You have no right to interfere. My father insisted. This is between us. You invited an audience, Daniel replied calmly, which means the consequences will be public as well. He glanced around the table, acknowledging the witnesses without addressing them directly. I'd advise everyone here to remember what they're seeing. My father bristled. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you, Daniel said. There's a difference. The silence stretched again, thicker now. I could feel it pressing against my ears, against my ribs. My arm throbbed, but I stood straighter than I had before the shock, giving way to something steadier. Daniel turned slightly toward me. Miss Whitman, he said, do you wish to sign anything tonight? I didn't hesitate. No. He nodded once. Then that ends the matter. Ethan scoffed weakly. You can't just declare that, he said. This isn't how this works. Daniel's gaze slid to him, cool and precise. Actually, he said, it is. He addressed the room again. Any document signed under duress is void. Any attempt to coerce consent, especially through physical force, carries legal consequences. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Daniel didn't press. He didn't gloat. He simply waited, letting the weight of his words settle. Around us, people shifted in their chairs. A woman near the end of the table whispered something to the man beside her. Someone else glanced pointedly at my father's hand, now clenched at his side. This isn't over, my father said finally, his voice lower, strained. Daniel met his gaze without flinching. It is for tonight, he said, and I strongly suggest you keep it that way. He turned back to me. Do you feel safe staying here? I looked around the room, at my mother's pale face, at Ethan's averted eyes, at the people who had watched silently when my father grabbed me. No, I said. Then we'll be leaving, Daniel said simply. He stepped aside, giving me space. I picked up my coat with hands that were still shaking, though my resolve felt firm. As I moved past my father, he reached out slightly, then stopped himself, his hand hovering uselessly in the air. Claire, he said, his voice rough. This isn't how it was supposed to go. I paused just long enough to look at him. I know, I said. That's the point. As we headed toward the door, the room remained silent. No one stopping us, no one offering protest. The power had shifted, and everyone felt it. Just before we stepped outside, Daniel leaned slightly toward me. You did exactly what Samuel hoped you would, he said quietly. I swallowed the words, landing deeper than anything else that night. Behind us, the party stood suspended, unfinished. The illusion finally cracked. We didn't leave the house immediately. Not yet. Daniel paused just inside the foyer, turning back toward the dining room, as if the night hadn't quite finished with us. The silence followed him, thick and expectant, and I realized everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Before anyone says anything, Daniel said calmly, I want to make something clear. My father stiffened. My mother sat frozen at the table, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Ethan stared at the floor like it might offer him a way out. This isn't a misunderstanding, Daniel continued. It isn't a difference of opinion. What just happened was an attempt to force a legal outcome through intimidation. The word hung in the air. Intimidation. Not tradition. Not family. Not confusion. My father scoffed weakly. "You're exaggerating," he said. "This got out of hand. That's all." Daniel didn't argue. He simply opened his briefcase and removed a thin folder, placing it on the sideboard where everyone could see it. "This is the executed will," he said, "signed, witnessed, and filed months ago." A murmur ran through the room. "And this," he added, lifting a second folder, "is supplementary documentation. Samuel prepared in anticipation of resistance." My heart thudded. Anticipation? Grandpa had known. My father's face tightened. He had no reason to do that. He had every reason, Daniel replied. And he was very specific. Ethan finally looked up. "This is unnecessary," he said, trying to sound confident. "Claire doesn't even want the house long term. Everyone knows that." Daniel turned his attention to him for the first time. "Is that so?" Ethan hesitated. "She's busy. She lives hours away. It's not practical." "That's not what I asked," Daniel said evenly. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were inching closer. I could sense people shifting, recalculating where they stood. The casual warmth from earlier had evaporated, replaced by something sharper and less forgiving. My father cleared his throat. "Look," he said, spreading his hands. "No one is trying to take advantage of anyone. We just want what's best for the family." Daniel met his gaze. "Coercion is not what's best for anyone." He tapped the second folder lightly. Samuel made it very clear that any attempt to pressure Claire into transferring ownership would be considered a violation of his intent. My mother spoke then, her voice trembling. Why would he think that she asked? Why would he assume we'd do something like this? Daniel didn't soften his tone. Because he observed patterns. No one responded. He watched who showed up, Daniel continued, who stayed, who listened. He noticed who treated Claire like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be respected. I felt a tightness in my chest, a mixture of grief and validation I wasn't prepared for. My father shook his head. "This is absurd. You're turning family conflict into a legal circus." "You turned it into a public spectacle," Daniel said. "I'm simply addressing it in the same arena." He glanced around the room again, making deliberate eye contact with several guests. "I would strongly advise against any further attempts to resolve this tonight." Someone near the door shifted uncomfortably. Another guest picked up their phone, then thought better of it and slipped it back into their pocket. "And just so we're clear," Daniel added, "this conversation doesn't end when people leave this house." My father bristled. "Are you threatening us?" "No," Daniel said. "I'm outlining reality." He closed the folders and returned them to his briefcase, the gesture final. "Claire has chosen not to sign. That decision stands. Any further pressure would be documented." My brother swallowed hard. For the first time, he looked unsure, his earlier confidence completely gone. I noticed he hadn't spoken again. Daniel turned to me. "Are you ready to go now?" I nodded. "Yes." As we moved toward the door, something shifted behind us. Chairs scraped softly. Conversations resumed in low, uncertain tones. The spell had broken. But just before we reached the threshold, my father spoke again, his voice quieter now. "You think this makes you right," he said. "Walking out like this." I stopped and turned. "I don't need to be right," I said. "I just need to be free." The words surprised me with how true they felt. Outside, the cold air hit my face sharp and grounding. I took a deep breath, my pulse slowly settling as the muffled sounds of the party faded behind the closed door. Daniel stood beside me on the front steps. Samuel was very clear about one thing he said. He didn't want this resolved through force. He wanted it resolved through truth. I looked back at the house, the lights still blazing. the celebration fractured beyond repair. "I think the truth finally arrived," I said. Daniel nodded. "And once it does, there's no putting it back." We walked down the driveway together, leaving behind a room full of people forced to sit with what they had just witnessed. I didn't know yet how far the consequences would reach. I only knew that the ground beneath my family's carefully constructed story had started to crumble. And for the first time, I wasn't the one standing on unstable ground. The fallout didn't wait for morning. By the time I woke up the next day, my phone was already buzzing on the nightstand, vibrating itself closer to the edge with every new notification. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment before reaching for it, bracing myself for whatever version of reality had formed overnight. Missed calls, text messages, emails. Most of them were from family. My mother had called 4 times between midnight and 6 a.m. My aunt had left a voicemail that lasted nearly 3 minutes. My cousin Jenna had sent a text that simply read, "We need to talk." This went too far. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed, suddenly aware of how quiet my apartment felt. No raised voices, no judgment, no pressure hanging in the air. Just the hum of traffic outside and the faint glow of morning light creeping through the curtains. I checked my email next. That was when I saw it. An unfamiliar address sent at 2:14 a.m. subject line, "Regarding last night." The sender was Thomas Green, my father's attorney. I opened it slowly. The email was carefully worded, polite to the point of being sterile. It acknowledged an unfortunate escalation during the New Year's party and suggested that all parties might benefit from resolving this matter discreetly and expeditiously. There was a proposed meeting attached, neutral location. No mention of lawyers present, though the irony wasn't lost on me. At the bottom, one sentence stood out. "Given the visibility of the incident, my client is eager to prevent further reputational consequences." So that was it. Not concern, not remorse. Damage control. I closed the email without replying. Around noon, Daniel called. "I figured you'd be awake by now," he said. "I am," I replied. "Barely." "I won't sugarcoat this," he said. "Your father has been making calls since early this morning." "To who?" "Anyone who will answer," Daniel said. "Board members, donors, old partners, people he believes can help contain the situation." I leaned back against the couch, pressing my fingers to my temple. And it's not going well. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Several people left that party deeply uncomfortable. Daniel continued. Not because of the inheritance dispute, because of how far he went, because of what they saw. I thought of the room falling silent, of my father's hand on my arm, of the way no one stepped in until Daniel did. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now Daniel said you hold your ground." I glanced at the bruises blooming faintly along my arm, yellow and purple under the skin. I hadn't covered them yet, hadn't decided whether I would. "I'm not backing down," I said. "I know," he replied. "But I need you to understand something. This isn't just family drama anymore. It's becoming public narrative." As if on cue, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a news alert. Local outlet. Business section. I tapped it open. The headline didn't name names, but it didn't need to. Prominent real estate executive faces scrutiny after family altercation at private event. My stomach dropped. The article was brief, cautious, but devastating in its restraint. It referenced multiple eyewitnesses' allegations of coercive behavior and questions surrounding governance and ethics. No accusations, no sensational language, just facts arranged in a way that made denial impossible. Daniel exhaled audibly when I told him. That was fast. "It's already out there," I said. "Yes," he replied. "And once it is, the story stops being controllable." By mid-afternoon, the calls changed tone. My mother finally reached me when I was standing in the kitchen staring blankly at an untouched mug of coffee. "Claire," she said, her voice thin. "Please, we need to fix this." "Fix?" The word landed wrong. "There's nothing to fix," I said. "You embarrassed your father," she insisted. "In front of everyone." I closed my eyes. He grabbed me. A pause. Then softer. He lost his temper. "No," I said. He showed it. Silence stretched between us. "People are talking," she said finally. "They're questioning everything. His leadership. Our family." I gripped the edge of the counter. "They should." Her breath caught. "You don't mean that." "I do," I said. "Because none of this happened in secret. You all thought it would stay contained, that I'd give in quietly like I always have." "That's not fair," she said. "It's accurate." She started to cry, then quiet and uneven. "We raised you better than this." I felt something inside me go still. "You raised me to be quiet," I said, "to make things easier for everyone else." I finally stopped doing that. She hung up without another word. By evening, Daniel called again. "2 sponsors have paused their involvement," he said, "and 1 board member has requested an internal review." I sank into the chair. "Because of me. Because of your father," Daniel corrected. "This isn't backlash, it's consequence." I stared at the wall across from me, the truth settling in with an unexpected weight. Everything he'd built on reputation and control was unraveling faster than he could hold it together, and for the first time, it wasn't my job to save him from it. Later that night, my brother texted. "No jokes this time, no sarcasm. I didn't know it would get this bad," he wrote. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "It was already bad," I typed back. "You just never had to feel it." There was no reply. I turned off my phone after that. I stood by the window watching the city lights flicker on as darkness settled in, feeling strangely calm beneath the chaos. The noise, the fallout, the shifting power, it was all happening without me chasing it, managing it, or absorbing the blame. For once, I wasn't shrinking to make the situation easier. I thought about Grandpa, about how he'd looked at me when he said, "You don't owe anyone your silence." Now everyone was hearing the truth, and they couldn't unhear it. The meeting request came 3 days later, wrapped in the language of reconciliation and urgency. Daniel forwarded the message with a single line beneath it. "They're ready to negotiate." I read the email twice, then a third time, letting the phrasing sink in. Neutral conference room. Independent mediator. No press. No recordings. They wanted control back, even if it meant pretending to be reasonable. I agreed to meet. Not because I owed them anything, but because I wanted to look my father in the eye when he realized the rules had changed. The building was downtown glass and steel, designed to feel important without revealing who actually held power inside. Daniel was already there when I arrived, standing near the elevators with a folder tucked under his arm. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly as we walked toward the conference room. "I know," I replied, "but I want to." My father was already seated when we walked in. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but something about his posture was different, less commanding, less certain. Across from him sat Thomas Green, his attorney expression carefully blank. My mother wasn't there. That somehow hurt more than if she had been. We took our seats. The mediator introduced himself, outlined the ground rules, then invited my father to speak first. He cleared his throat. "I want to start by saying that things got out of hand." I waited. "There was a misunderstanding," he continued. "Emotions were high." Daniel shifted beside me, but I kept my gaze steady. "You grabbed me," I said. "That wasn't a misunderstanding." His jaw tightened. "I was trying to protect the family. By forcing me to give up what Grandpa left me," I said. "In front of 20 people." Silence filled the room. Thomas Green leaned forward. Perhaps we can focus on solutions. I turned to him. The solution is simple. The house is mine. My father laughed once, short and sharp. You don't need it. I smiled, slow and deliberate. That's not for you to decide. The mediator raised a hand gently. Mr. Carter, your daughter is the legal beneficiary. Contesting the will would be disastrous, Daniel finished calmly. And expensive. My father's eyes flicked to him. You've always been good at dramatics. And you've always underestimated your daughter, Daniel replied. That landed. My father leaned back, folding his arms. You're enjoying this. No, I said. I'm done surviving it. The mediator suggested a break. My father stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city as if it might offer him answers. When we resumed, his tone had changed. I'll accept the will as written, he said. But there are conditions. I felt something cold settle in my chest. There are no conditions. There always are, he said. That house carries the family name. It shouldn't be misused. Misused how sold, renovated beyond recognition, turned into something that disrespects our legacy. I thought of Grandpa's laughter echoing through the old halls, of the way he'd told me legacy wasn't about control, it was about care. I will do whatever I want with my property, I said. That's what Grandpa trusted me to do. My father's voice hardened. You're tearing this family apart. I met his gaze. You did that when you chose power over your own child. The mediator cleared his throat again. Mr. Carter, given the public attention, my father held up a hand. I know. His eyes flicked to the folder Daniel had brought, thick with documents I hadn't seen yet. Evidence I realized. Safeguards. What do you want? My father asked quietly. The question startled me. I thought for a moment, truly thought about what I wanted. I want space, I said. I want respect, and I want you to stop treating me like a problem to be managed. His shoulders slumped slightly. And if I agree, then we can talk, I said. Eventually. On my terms. Thomas Green scribbled notes. The mediator nodded. And the press, my father asked. That depends on you, Daniel said. Any further attempts to coerce, intimidate, or manipulate will be addressed appropriately. My father looked at me, then really looked as if seeing me for the first time without the lens of expectation. You've changed, he said. I've grown, I replied. The meeting ended without handshakes. Outside, the winter air felt sharp and clean. Daniel exhaled as we stepped onto the sidewalk. You held your ground, he said. I didn't know I could, I admitted. He smiled. You always could. You just never had backup before. That night I went back to my apartment and opened the box Grandpa had left me months ago, the one I'd been too afraid to touch. Inside were letters, old photographs, and a single envelope with my name on it. I sat on the floor and opened it. My dear Claire, it began. If you're reading this, it means you finally stopped asking permission to be yourself. Tears blurred the words, but I kept reading. I left you that house because I trusted you to live without fear. Don't let anyone convince you that your strength is a betrayal. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it to my chest. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet revolution taking place in my living room. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for approval. I was building something new, and no one was going to take it from me. The house didn't feel like mine the first time I unlocked the door alone. I stood on the porch for a long moment, key still in my hand, listening to the wind move through the trees that lined the long driveway. The place looked exactly the same as it always had, white clapboard tall windows, the wraparound porch my grandfather loved, but something about stepping toward it without asking permission felt surreal. When I finally went inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and dust, layered with memories that hadn't decided whether to comfort or overwhelm me. I moved slowly room by room. The living room still held his old leather chair angled toward the window, the one where he used to sit every morning with his coffee and the newspaper folded just so. The bookshelves were unchanged law books mixed with biographies and dog-eared paperbacks. I ran my fingers along the spines, stopping at one he'd made me read in college. "For when you forget who you are," he'd written inside the cover. I swallowed hard and kept going. In the kitchen, I found the calendar still hanging on the wall, turned to December. His handwriting filled the squares in neat, precise lines. Doctor appointments. Notes to call me. A reminder written in red ink on the 15th, Claire coming this weekend. I sank into one of the chairs at the table and let myself breathe. The past weeks had been so loud. Meetings, calls, headlines, the constant hum of consequence catching up to choices that had been buried for decades. Here there was only quiet and the echo of a man who had seen me when no one else bothered to look closely. I stayed the night. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of raised voices and crowded rooms, but I woke just after dawn to sunlight spilling across the floor. For the first time since the New Year's party, my chest didn't feel tight. I made coffee and carried my mug out to the porch, wrapping myself in an old sweater I found draped over the back of a chair. The ocean wasn't far, and the air tasted like salt and winter. This was real. Later that morning, Daniel called. "I wanted to check in," he said. "How are you holding up?" "I'm here," I replied. "At the house." There was a pause. "How does that feel?" I looked out at the yard, the bare branches, the long stretch of land that had always been treated like a symbol instead of a home. Like I finally arrived somewhere I was always meant to be. "I'm glad," he said. "I also wanted to let you know. The board made their decision." I straightened slightly. "And your father has stepped down from 2 committees," Daniel said. "And 3 contracts were officially terminated this morning." I closed my eyes. "I didn't ask for that," I said. "I know," he replied, "but the world is responding to what it saw." After we hung up, I checked my phone for the first time in hours. There was a message from my mother. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you," it read. "I've been thinking about that night non-stop. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know I see it now." I didn't reply right away. Instead, I walked upstairs to my grandfather's study, a room I'd always loved because it felt like a sanctuary. Sunlight streamed through the window onto his desk where a single drawer sat slightly open. Inside, I found an envelope I hadn't noticed before. My name was written on it in his careful hand. I opened it slowly. "Claire, if this letter is in your hands, then you did the hardest thing there is. You chose yourself." The words blurred, but I kept reading. Families love to confuse obedience with loyalty. They call it tradition. But tradition without kindness is just control dressed up in respectability. I wanted you to have a place where no one could tell you who you're allowed to be. I pressed the letter to my chest, tears finally falling without resistance. That afternoon, my brother showed up. He stood at the end of the driveway, hands shoved into his coat pockets, looking uncertain in a way I'd never seen before. I watched him for a moment through the window before stepping outside. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me," he said. "I don't know yet," I replied honestly. He nodded, accepting that. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said quickly. I needed to say I'm sorry. For all of it. For standing there. For letting him treat you like that." I studied his face, searching for defensiveness for the old entitlement. "I believe you," I said finally. "But belief doesn't erase damage." "I know," he said. "I'm trying to figure out how to live with that." We stood there in silence, the wind moving between us. "I'm getting help," he added, "for the mess I made." I nodded. "That's good." He hesitated. "Do you think someday?" "Someday isn't today," I said gently. "But it exists." He exhaled, relief flickering across his face. "That's more than I expected." After he left, I went back inside and closed the door, feeling the weight of boundaries settling into place. Not walls, just lines drawn with intention. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat on the porch again and thought about how close I'd come to giving everything up. How easily I'd been trained to believe my role was to make things easier for everyone else. The house was quiet behind me, solid and steady. This wasn't revenge. This was restoration. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for the next demand, the next disappointment, the next moment where I'd be told to shrink. I was standing on ground that belonged to me, and I wasn't leaving. 1 year later, the house was full again, not crowded, not tense, just full. I stood in the kitchen early that morning, rolling dough on the old wooden counter my grandfather had refinished himself decades ago. Outside, winter sunlight filtered through the trees, pale and steady. The ocean wind carried the faint smell of salt the same way it always had. This time, the house felt like it was breathing with me, instead of holding its breath. I had spent the past year rebuilding in ways I hadn't planned. Not just the house, though, that had happened too. I'd kept the structure intact, honored the bones of it, but turned one upstairs room into a small office overlooking the water. A place to think. A place to work. A place where no one could tell me I didn't belong. But the real rebuilding happened quietly inside. I stopped answering calls that felt like demands. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. I stopped shrinking. Around noon, the first car pulled into the driveway. My mother stepped out carrying a covered dish in both hands. She hesitated at the bottom of the porch steps like she wasn't sure she was allowed to come closer. I opened the door before she could knock. "Hi," I said. Her eyes filled instantly. "Hi." She looked around the house as if seeing it for the first time. "It looks warm." "It is," I replied. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I brought what Grandpa used to like. The stuffing." I followed his notes. "Thank you," I said and meant it. We didn't hug right away. We didn't have to. Some things didn't need to be rushed to feel real. My brother arrived next, slower than usual, his kids tumbling out of the back seat ahead of him. They ran straight past us toward the beach path, laughter cutting through the cold air. He stayed back, hands in his pockets. "I didn't know if today was okay," he said. "It is," I answered. "You're here." He nodded, relief softening his face. "I'm still taking it one day at a time." "I know," I said. "That's all anyone can do." Friends arrived after that. People who had shown up for me when everything fell apart. People who knew me as I was, not as a role I was supposed to play. The house filled with voices that didn't carry expectations or conditions. There was an empty chair at the table. My father wasn't there. That was intentional. We had coffee once a month now. Neutral places. Clear boundaries. He was learning slowly what respect looked like when it wasn't enforced by fear or tradition. Holidays were still too heavy, too layered with old habits. Maybe someday. Not today. When we finally sat down to eat, someone raised a glass to my grandfather. Not with a speech. Just a simple acknowledgement. To Harold, they said. For teaching us what showing up really means. I felt my throat tighten, but I smiled. Later, when the dishes were stacked and the kids were back outside building something crooked and joyful out of driftwood, I stepped onto the porch alone. The sky was turning soft shades of gray and blue. The ocean moved the way it always had, indifferent to human drama, steady and sure. I thought about the woman I had been a year ago, standing in a room full of people who believed they had the right to decide my worth, believing for just a moment that maybe they were right. I almost signed that paper. I almost handed over my inheritance, my autonomy, my future, because it felt easier than enduring their disappointment. But easier isn't the same as right. What I learned isn't that family can betray you. I already knew that. What I learned is that silence can too. Silence lets other people write your story for you. Silence convinces you that peace only comes from compliance. Silence teaches you to confuse endurance with strength. Speaking up cost me comfort. It cost me illusion. But it gave me my life back. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, if you've ever been pressured to give up something that mattered because it made other people uncomfortable, I want you to know this. You're not selfish for protecting what's yours. You're not difficult for saying no. And you're not wrong for choosing yourself even when the room turns quiet. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from or what part of this felt familiar. Your stories matter more than you think. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about family boundaries, quiet strength, and the moment the power finally shifts, consider subscribing and staying with us here. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop asking for permission. This was my story. And if you're standing at the edge of your own, I hope you step forward.